I feel very vintage right now. I hope this doesn't like awaken anything within me. Okay, so you're new to quilting and you've picked up your first pattern and you're super excited to start this journey. You're at the fabric store, pattern in hand, and you're ready to get to the goods and begin. But you're looking at the pattern to figure out what you need, and it feels like you're reading Greek, or maybe a cookbook. Quilting has a lot of jargon that not every pattern explains, which can be really tough for new quilters. Lucky for you, I'm here to help you figure out what some common confusing terms are. If this interests you, make sure you like and subscribe for more videos like this. Let's start with the big ones. Cutting is the blanket term for when you're cutting your fabric. Always double and triple check to make sure you're cutting in accordance with your pattern's instructions. Fabric's expensive, you want to do it right. So when we talk about quilting, a lot of people actually visualize this step. Piecing is when you take the cut pieces of fabric and sew them together. Doing this makes quilt blocks, which is several pieces of fabric sewn together to make a specific shape. You put these blocks together to make the quilt top, which is all of the quilt blocks sewn together to make the final design. Applique is a quilting and sewing technique where fabric, usually cut into a specific shape, is placed on top of other pieces of fabric and secured in place either by hand or with your sewing or embroidery machine. Quilting, confusingly, is both the name of the whole art and the specific step where you sew your quilt top, your batting, and your backing together. This can be done by machine or by hand. Some people even take their quilts to professional long-arm quilters, especially if their quilts are really big. Backing refers to the fabric that goes on the back of your quilt. This can be one big piece of fabric or more than one pieced together. Batting is the fluffy cotton, wool, or poly blend that goes in between your quilt top and your backing. This is what gives your quilt its weight as well as its dimension. There are different types of batting, but we aren't going to get into that right now. The quilt sandwich is when you have layered your quilt top, your batting, and your backing together, but you haven't quilted it yet. Think of the fabric as the bread and the batting as the filling. Binding is just the fabric and method of finishing the edges of your quilt. Typically, it's a long strip of 2.5-inch wide fabric that has been sewn all the way around your quilt, making sure all of the raw edges are covered. Look out for a future video about how binding works. Bias binding is just a different way to make binding, and some quilt patterns specifically call for it. Essentially, you cut your binding fabric at an angle instead of straight up and down. Again, watch out for a future video about binding. Overage is a term you'll hear in association with your backing fabric and your batting. The size of your quilt is going to be the size of your quilt top, but you want your batting and your backing to be larger than your quilt, because the different elements are going to stretch and move during the quilting process. A good rule of thumb is to have about 4 inches of overage on each side of your quilt top. A 1/4-inch seam is the standard seam allowance for quilting. If your pattern doesn't say what the seam allowance is when you're piecing, assume that it's a 1/4 inch. You can use a special 1/4 inch foot, tape a guideline on your machine, and some machines even have a special 1/4 inch stitch built in. Just use whatever works best for you. Some quilt patterns call for a scant 1/4 inch seam. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a seam allowance that is just shy of being a 1/4 inch seam. Sometimes your blocks come out a little smaller than you want them to because some size is lost in the seam when you press it, and this is just a way to combat that. The more intricate the pattern, the more likely you'll have to use a scant 1/4 inch seam. So those are some broad terms that might be unfamiliar to new quilters. Now let's go over the terms that you typically see on the back of your pattern when you're buying fabric. Yardage is the blanket term for buying fabric off the bolt, which is traditionally sold by the yard. If your pattern calls for a 1/2 yard of fabric, you'll get a fabric length of 18 inches. A 1/4 yard is 9 inches, a yard is 36 inches, and so on. If someone asks you, how much yardage does it call for? Typically, they are asking for a specific number. WOF is an acronym you'll see all the time. It stands for width of fabric, which just means from selvage to selvage. It's tempting, especially with smaller cuts, to think of selvage to selvage as the length, but you have to remember that the fabric was originally on 10, 15, 20, or more yard bolts. For quilting, width of fabric will typically be between 42 and 44 inches. Directional fabric is fabric where the pattern is going in a specific direction. It'll look different if you turn it, and there's clear movement on the pattern. The images will be upside down or sideways if you don't position it right. Directional fabric is fun, but not always the best when you're just learning how to quilt. Typically, your pattern will tell you whether or not it's suitable for directional fabric, but sometimes you just have to use your best guess. So let's get into precuts. Precuts are fun, and you might have a pattern that says it's precut friendly. Precuts are just fabric bundles that have been cut to uniform measurements, and they're a real time saver. They also coordinate well because they are all from the same fabric line. There are a lot of different types, so let's go over a few of them. A fat quarter is a cut of fabric that is about 18 inches by about 21 to 22 inches. A lot of fabric stores will sell these individually, or they come in bundles, and some stores will even cut them for you off the bolt. A fat eighth is simply half a fat quarter. Typically, these cannot be sold individually and are part of a packaged set. Some quilts, super detailed quilts, or quilts featuring applique usually call for these. Jelly rolls are probably the most popular precut. It's a set of about 42 fabric pieces that are cut to 2.5 inches wide. If you hate cutting, or you worry that you can't cut straight on narrow pieces of fabric, definitely look into jelly rolls. Honey buns are essentially smaller jelly rolls. Instead of 2.5 inches, the strips in a honey bun are cut to 1.5 inches. A layer cake is a bundle of about 42 10-inch squares of fabric. A charm pack is essentially a smaller layer cake. Instead of 10-inch squares, it's 5-inch squares. Breaking it down even more, a mini charm pack is just 2.5-inch squares. These are fantastic for scrappy quilts, by the way. Now you have your fabric and you're starting to construct your quilt. Let's explain some terms that you might run across. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are common terms that might not be explained in every pattern. HST is another acronym you'll likely see in your pattern, and some of them will assume that you already know what it means. HST stands for half square triangle, which is a type of quilt block. There's different ways to make them, but essentially you sew two pieces of fabric together on the diagonal to get a square that is made of two triangles. Your pattern will likely tell you the method they want you to use to construct your half square triangles. Oh boy, this is a matter of debate in the quilting community, and we don't have time to unpack it all right now. Good news, most newer patterns are going to give you pressing instructions. So pressing seams is just the step where you iron your pieced fabric to make it lie flat. When you press your seams open, each seam allowance is folded towards its corresponding fabric with a stitch line in the middle. When you press your seam to the side, both pieces of fabric will be on top of one another with the stitch line to the side. A good rule of thumb is to press your fabric to the darkest fabric because then it's less likely to show through your quilt top. Sashing is a term you'll likely come across in your pattern instructions. Sashing is just the fabric that goes in between quilt feature blocks. Not every quilt will have sashing, but at the end of the day, it's just long strips of fabric in the center of a quilt top. Borders are technically different from sashing. It's still long strips of fabric, but these strips go around the outside of your quilt. Often, quilters will add borders to increase the size. They do not have to go on all four sides, and some fabric manufacturers make specific border fabric, whose pattern looks best when attached to the top and bottom of a quilt. Often, border fabric is directional. No! No! It's all falling apart! Oh no! When did this happen? Okay, that's fine. We'll make it work. Okay, so those were some common quilting terms that you may or may not have run across. This is by no means an exhaustive list. There's tons more quilting jargon out there. So if you have any questions, make sure you leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching, and if you liked this, remember to like and subscribe. I've got even more videos coming your way. Bye now.